Hello, alchemists. Welcome or welcome back. My name is Ava, aka queenmidaslifealchemist, and I am back for week 18 of The Body Keeps the Score here on Weekend Book Club, Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma. This is written by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. Again, this is week 18 of 19, so we have been already traveling through this book. So if this is your first week, welcome. I'm going to link or put the little link for the first week up here at the top of the video, so you can just go there, so you can start from the beginning, because we are moving through this book and there's a lot of amazing information that's shared here around healing trauma and fears and emotional pain. So yeah, so just a really quick announcement. In my description box below, you will find my link tree, which has all of my information. It's got my link to join my Patreon over there. We have private bi-weekly chats. There's a private newsletter, personal oracle readings, one-on-one coaching, some bonus material, and early access to content that I upload here. Also, there's bigger discounts in my partner shops, which is Olivera by Elizabeth, Liz's Etsy shop, t-shirt shop, and then also Soulstone Organites, which is Dory's Organite Pyramid shop. So that being said, oh, and also I have my booking link on there for personal tarot and oracle readings, if you would like that as well, and all my tip jar links, so Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, and then affiliate links as well. So, all right, now that we've got that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on week 18. We're picking up on page 322. This says helping the brain to focus. I'm just gonna, okay, I had to check my microphone. Page 322, it says neurofeedback can improve creativity, athletic control, and inner awareness, even in people who are already highly accomplished. When we started to study neurofeedback, we discovered that sports medicine was the only department in Boston University that had any familiarity with the subject. One of my earliest teachers in brain physiology was the sports psychologist Lynn Zykowski, who soon left Boston to train the Vancouver Canucks with neurofeedback. Neurofeedback has probably been studied more thoroughly as performance enhancement than for psychiatric problems. In Italy, the trainer for the soccer club AC Milan used it to help players remain relaxed and focused as they watch videos of their errors. Their increased knowledge and physiological control paid off when several players joined the Italian team that won the 2006 World Cup, and when AC Milan won the European Championship the following year. Neurofeedback was also included in the science and technology component of On the Podium, a $117 million 5-year plan engineered to help Canada dominate the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. The Canadians won the most gold medals and came in 3rd overall. Musical performance has also been shown to benefit as well. A panel of judges from Britain's Royal College of Music found that students who were trained with 10 sessions of neurofeedback by John Gruslier of the University of London had a 10% improvement in the performance of a piece of music compared to students who had not received neurofeedback. This represents a huge difference in such a competitive field. Given its enhancement of focus, attention, and concentration, it's not surprising that neurofeedback drew the attention of specialists in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. At least 36 students have shown that neurofeedback can be an effective and time-limited treatment for ADHD, one that's about as effective as conventional drugs. Once the brain has been trained to produce different patterns of electrical communication, no further treatment is necessary. In contrast to drugs, which do not change fundamental brain activity and work only as long as the patient keeps taking them. New section on page 323 called Where is the Problem in My Brain? Sophisticated computerized EEG analysis, known as the quantitative EEG or QEEG, can trace brainwave activity millisecond by millisecond. And its software can convert that activity into a color map that shows which frequencies are highest or lowest in key areas of the brain. The QEEG can also show how well brain regions are communicating or working together. Several large QEEG databases of both normal and abnormal patterns are available, which allows us to compare a patient's QEEG with those of thousands of other people with similar issues. Last but not least, in contrast to fMRIs and related scans, the QEEG is both relatively inexpensive and portable. The QEEG provides compelling evidence of the arbitrary boundaries of current DSM diagnostic categories. DSM labels for mental illness are not aligned with specific patterns of brain activation. Mental states that are common to many diagnoses, such as confusion, agitation, or feeling disembodied, are associated with specific patterns on the QEEG. In general, the more problems a patient has, the more abnormalities show up in the QEEG. Our patients find it very helpful to be able to see the patterns of localized electrical activity in their brains. We can show them the patterns that seem to be responsible for their difficulty focusing or for their lack of emotional control. They can see why different brain areas need to be trained to generate different frequencies and communication patterns. These explanations help them shift from self-blaming attempts to control their behavior or to learning to process information differently. As Ed Hamlin, who trained us in interpreting the QEEG, recently wrote to me, many people respond to the training, but the ones that respond best and quickest are those that can see how the feedback is related to something they are doing. For example, if I am attempting to help someone increase their ability to be present, we can see how they're doing it. Then the benefit really begins to accumulate. There is something very empowering about having the experience of changing your brain's activity with your mind. Next section, called How Does Trauma Change the Brain Waves, on page 324. In our neurofeedback lab, we see individuals with long histories of traumatic stress who have only partially responded to existing treatments. Their QEEGs show a variety of different patterns. Often there is excessive activity in the right temporal lobe, the fear center of the brain, combined with too much frontal slow wave activity. This means that their hyper-aroused emotional brains dominate their mental life. Our research showed that calming the fear center decreases trauma-based problems and improves executive functioning. This is reflected not only in a significant decrease in patients' PTSD scores, but also in improved mental clarity and an increased ability to regulate how upset they become in response to relatively minor precautions. Other traumatized patients show patterns of hyperactivity the moment they close their eyes. Not seeing what is going on around them makes them panic and their brain waves go wild. We train them to produce more relaxed brain patterns, yet another group overreacts to sounds and light, a sign that thalamus has difficulty filtering out irrelevant information. In those patients, we focus on changing communication patterns at the back of the brain. While our center is focused on finding optimal treatments for long-standing traumatic stress, Alex McFarlane is studying how exposure to combat changes previously normal brains. The Australian Department of Defense asked his research group to measure the effects of deployment to combat in Iraq and Afghanistan on mental and biological functioning, including brainwave patterns. In the initial phase, McFarlane and his colleagues measured the QEEG in 179 combat troops 4 months prior to and 4 months after each successive deployment to the Middle East. They found that the total number of months in combat over a 3-year period was associated with progressive decreases in alpha power at the back of the brain. This area, which monitors the state of the body and regulates such elementary processes as sleep and hunger, ordinarily has the highest level of alpha waves of any region in the brain, particularly when people close their eyes. As we have seen, alpha is associated with relaxation. The decrease in alpha power in these soldiers reflects a state of persistent agitation. At the same time, the brain waves at the front of the brain, which normally have high levels of beta, show a progressive slowing with each deployment. The soldiers gradually develop frontal lobe activity that resembles that of children with ADHD, which interferes with their executive functioning and capacity for focused attention. The net effect is that arousal, which is supposed to provide us with the energy needed to engage in day-to-day tasks, no longer helps these soldiers to focus on ordinary tasks. It simply makes them agitated and restless. At this stage in McFarland's study, it is too early to know if any of these soldiers will develop PTSD, and only time will tell to what degree these brains will read just to the pace of civilian life. We are on to the next section called Neurofeedback and Learning Disabilities. This is page 325. Chronic abuse and neglect in childhood interfere with the proper wiring of sensory integration systems. In some cases, this results in learning disabilities, which include faulty connections between the auditory and word processing systems and poor hand-eye coordination. As long as they are frozen or explosive, it is difficult to see how much trouble the adolescents in their residential treatment programs have processing day-to-day information. But once their behavioral problems have been successfully treated, their learning disabilities often become manifest. Even if these traumatized kids could sit still and pay attention, many of them would still be handicapped by their poor learning skills. Lisa described how trauma had interfered with the proper wiring of basic processing functions. She told me she always got lost going places, and she recalled having a marked auditory delay that kept her from being able to follow the instructions from her teachers. Imagine being in a classroom, she said, and the teacher comes in and says, "Good morning. Turn to page 272. Do problems 1 to 5. If you're even a fraction of a second off, it's just a jumble." It was impossible to concentrate. Neurofeedback helped her reverse these learning disabilities. I learned to keep track of things, for example, to read maps. Right after we started therapy, there was this memorable time when I was going from Amherst to Northampton, less than 10 miles, to meet Sabern. I was supposed to take a couple of buses, but I ended up walking the highway for a couple of miles. I was that disorganized. I couldn't read the schedule. I couldn't keep track of the time. I was too jacked up and nervous, which made me tired all the time. I couldn't pay attention and keep it together. I just couldn't organize my brain around it. That statement defines the challenge of brain and mind science. How can we help people learn to organize time and space, distance and relationships, capacities that are laid down in the brain during the first few years of life if early trauma has interfered with their development? Neither drugs nor conventional therapy have been shown to activate the neuroplasticity necessary to bring their capacities online after the critical periods have passed. Now is a time to study whether neurofeedback can succeed where other interventions have failed. New section on page 326 called Alpha Theta Training. Alpha Theta Training is a particularly fascinating neurofeedback procedure because it can induce the sort of hypnagogic states, the essence of hypnotic trance that are discussed in chapter 15. When theta waves predominate in the brain, the mind's focus is on the internal world, a world of free-floating imagery. Alpha brain waves may act as a bridge from the external world to the internal and vice versa. In alpha theta, training these frequencies are alternately rewarded. The challenge in PTSD is to open the mind to new possibilities so that the present is no longer interpreted as a continuous reliving of the past. Trance states during which theta activity dominates can help to loosen the conditioned connections between particular stimuli and responses, such as loud cracks signaling gunfire or a harbinger of death. A new association can be created in which that same crack can come to be linked to 4th of July fireworks at the end of a day at the beach with loved ones. In the twilight states fostered by alpha theta training, traumatic events may be safely re-experienced and new associations fostered. Some patients report unusual imagery and or deep insights about their life. Others simply become more relaxed and less rigid. Any state in which people can safely experience images, feelings, and emotions that are associated with dread and helplessness is likely to create fresh potential and wider perspective. Can alpha theta reverse hyperarousal patterns? The accumulated evidence is promising. Eugene Peniston and Paul Kolkowski, researchers at the VA Medical Center in Fort Lyon, Colorado, used neurofeedback to treat 29 Vietnam veterans with a 12 to 15-year history of chronic combat-related PTSD. 15 of the men were randomly assigned to the EEG alpha theta training and 14 to a control group that received standard medical care, including psychotropic drugs and individual and group therapy. On average, patients in both groups had been hospitalized more than 5 times for their PTSD. The neurofeedback facilitated twilight states of learning by rewarding both alpha and theta waves. As the men lay back in a recliner with their eyes closed, they were coached to allow the neurofeedback sounds to guide them into deep relaxation. They were also asked to use positive mental imagery, for example, being sober, living confidently and happily, as they moved toward the trance-like alpha theta state. This study, published in 1991, had one of the best outcomes ever recorded for PTSD. The neurofeedback group had a significant decrease in their PTSD symptoms, as well as in physical complaints, depression, anxiety, and paranoia. After the treatment phase, the veterans and their family members were contacted monthly for a period of 30 months. Only 3 of the 15 neurofeedback treated veterans reported disturbing flashbacks and nightmares. All 3 chose to undergo 10 booster sessions. Only 1 needed to return to the hospital for further treatment. 14 out of 15 were using significantly less medication. In contrast, every vet in the comparison group experienced an increase in PTSD symptoms during the follow-up period, and all of them required at least 2 further hospitalizations. 10 of the comparison group also increased their medication use. This study has been replicated by other researchers, but it has received surprisingly little attention outside the neurofeedback community. We have a new section that we're starting here on page 327 called Neurofeedback, PTSD, and Addiction. Approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of severely traumatized people develop substance abuse problems. Since the time of Homer, soldiers have used alcohol to numb their pain, irritability, and depression. In one recent study, half of motor vehicle accident victims develop problems with drugs or alcohol. Alcohol abuse makes people careless and thus increases their chances of being traumatized again. Although being drunk during an assault actually decreases the likelihood of developing PTSD. There is a circular relationship between PTSD and substance abuse. While drugs and alcohol may provide temporary relief from trauma symptoms, withdrawing from them increases hyperarousal, thereby intensifying nightmares, flashbacks, and irritability. There are only 2 ways to end this vicious cycle: by resolving the symptoms of PTSD with methods such as EMDR, or by treating the hyperarousal that is part of both PTSD and withdrawal from drugs or alcohol. Drugs, such as naltrexone, are sometimes prescribed to reduce hyperarousal, but this treatment helps in only some cases. One of the first women I trained with neurofeedback had a long-standing cocaine addiction, in addition to a horrendous childhood history of sexual abuse and abandonment. Much to my surprise, her cocaine habit cleared after the first 2 sessions, and on follow-up 5 years later had not returned. I had never seen anyone recover this quickly from severe drug abuse, so I turned to the existing scientific literature for guidance. Most of the studies on this subject were done more than 2 decades ago. In recent years, very few neurofeedback studies for the treatment of addiction have been published, and at least in the United States. Between 75% and 80% of patients who are admitted for detox and alcohol and drug abuse treatment will relapse. Another study by Peniston and Kokolsky on the effects of neurofeedback training with veterans who had dual diagnosis of alcoholism and PTSD focused on this problem. 15 veterans received alpha theta training, while the control group received standard treatment without neurofeedback. The subjects were followed up regularly for 3 years, during which 8 members of the neurofeedback group stopped drinking completely, and 1 got drunk once but became sick and didn't drink again. Most of them were markedly less depressed. As Peniston put it, the changes reported corresponded to being more warm-hearted, more intelligent, more emotionally stable, more socially bold, more relaxed, and more satisfied. In contrast, all of those given standard treatment were readmitted to the hospital within 18 months. Since that time, a number of studies on neurofeedback for addictions have been published, but this important application needs much more research to establish its potential and limitations. All right, new section on page 328, the future of neurofeedback. If you are enjoying this content, please remember to like the video, share the video, starting with week 1, please. If there's someone that you feel will benefit from this information. And then also, if you're not subscribed, I would love to invite you to subscribe. It's completely free to you. It supports my channel, helps my content to get out there to more people, to help empower them to become the healers in their own lives and take their lives into their control. So all about empowering people here on this channel. Thank you. So again, page 328, the future of neurofeedback. In my practice, I use neurofeedback primarily to help with the hyperarousal, confusion, and concentration problems of people who suffer from developmental trauma. However, it has also shown good results for numerous issues and conditions that go beyond the scope of this book, including relieving tension headaches, improving cognitive function following a traumatic brain injury, reducing anxiety and panic attacks, learning to deepen meditation states, treating autism, improving seizure control, self-regulation and mood disorders, and more. As of 2013, neurofeedback is being used in 17 military and VA facilities to treat PTSD, and scientific documentation of its efficacy in recent combat vets is just beginning to be assessed. Frank Duffy, the director of the Clinical Neurophysiology and Developmental Neurophysiology Laboratories of Boston Children's Hospital, has commented, "The literature, which lacks any negative study, suggests that neurofeedback plays a major therapeutic role in many different areas. In my opinion, if any medication has demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used." Many questions remain to be answered about treatment protocols for neurofeedback, but the scientific paradigm is gradually shifting in a direction that invites a deeper exploration of these questions. In 2010, Thomas Enzel, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, published an article in Scientific American entitled "Faulty Circuits," in which he called for a return to understanding mind and brain in terms of the rhythms and patterns of electrical communication. Brain regions that function together to carry out normal and abnormal mental operations can be thought of as analogous to electrical circuits. The latest research shows that the malfunctioning of entire circuits may underlie many mental disorders. 3 years later, Enzel announced that NIMH was reorienting its research away from DSM categories and focused instead on disorders of the human connectome. As explained by Francis Collins, director of the National Institutes of Health, of which NIMH is a part, the connectome refers to the exquisitely interconnected network of neurons or nerve cells in your brain. Like the genome, the microbiome, and other exciting fields, The effort to map the connectome and decipher the electrical signals that zap through it to generate your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors has become possible through development of powerful new tools and technologies. The connectome is now being mapped in detail under the auspices of NIMH. As we wait the results of this research, I'd like to give the last word to Lisa, the survivor who introduced me to the enormous potential of neurofeedback. When I asked her to summarize what the treatment had done for her, she said, "It calmed me down. It stopped the dissociation. I can use my feelings. I'm not running away from them. I'm not held hostage by them. I can't turn them off and on, but I can put them away. I may be sad about the abuse I went through, but I can put it away. I can call a friend and not talk about it if I don't want to talk about it, or I can do homework or clean my apartment. Emotions mean something now. I'm not anxious all the time, and when I am anxious, I can reflect on it. If the anxiety is coming from the past, I can find it there, or I can look at how it relates to my life now. And it's not just negative emotions like anger and anxiety. I can reflect on love and intimacy or sexual attraction. I'm not in fight or flight all the time. My blood pressure is down. I'm not physically prepared to take off at any moment or defend myself against an attack. Neurofeedback made it possible for me to have a relationship. Neurofeedback freed me up to live my life the way I want to, because I'm not always in the thrall of how I was hurt and what it did to me. 4 years after I met her and recorded our conversations, Lisa graduated near the top of her nursing school class, and she now works full-time as a nurse at a local hospital. That is so awesome. Okay, we are on to a new chapter here called, chapter 20, called Finding Your Voice, Communal Rhythms and Theater. Starting out with a quote from Tina Packer: "Acting is not about putting on a character, but discovering the character within you. You are the character. You just have to find it within yourself, albeit a very expanded version of yourself." Many scientists I know were inspired by their children's health problems to find new ways of understanding brain, mind, and therapy. My own son's recovery from a mysterious illness that, for lack of a better name, we call chronic fatigue syndrome, convinced me of the therapeutic possibilities of theater. Nick spent most of 7th and 8th grade in bed, bloated by allergies and medications that left him too exhausted to go to school. His mother and I saw him becoming entrenched in his identity as a self-hating and isolated kid, and we were desperate to help him. When his mother realized that he picked up a little energy around 5 p.m., we signed him up for an evening class in improvisational theater, where he would at least have a chance to interact with other boys and girls his age. He took to the group and to the acting exercises and soon landed his first role as Action in West Side Story, a tough kid who's always ready to fight and has the lead in singing "Gee, Officer Krupke." One day at home, I caught him walking with a swagger, practicing what it was like to be somebody with clout. Was he developing a physical sense of pleasure, imagining himself as a strong guy who commands respect? Then he was cast as the Fonz in Happy Days. Being adored by girls and keeping an audience spellbound became the real tipping point in his recovery. Unlike his experience with the numerous therapists who had talked with him about how bad he felt, theater gave him a chance to deeply and physically experience what it was like to be someone other than the learning disabled, oversensitive boy that he had gradually become. Being a valued contributor to a group gave him a visceral experience of power and competence. I believe that this new embodied version of himself set him on the road to become the creative, young, loving adult he is today. Our sense of agency, how much we feel in control, is defined by our relationship with our bodies and its rhythms. Our waking and sleeping and how we eat, sit, and walk define the contours of our days. In order to find our voice, we have to be in our bodies, able to breathe fully, and able to access our inner sensations. This is the opposite of dissociation, of being out of body and making yourself disappear. It's also the opposite of depression, lying slumped in front of a screen that provides passive entertainment. Acting is an experience of using your body to take your place in life. New section called the Theater of War on page 331. Nick's transformation was not the first time I witnessed the benefits of theater. In 1988, I was still treating 3 veterans with PTSD whom I'd met at the VA. And when they showed a sudden improvement in their vitality, optimism, and family relationships, I attributed it to my growing therapeutic skills. Then I discovered that all 3 were involved in a theatrical production. Wanting to dramatize the plight of homeless veterans, they had persuaded playwright David Mamet, who was living nearby, to meet weekly with their group to develop a script around their experiences. Mamet then recruited Al Pacino, Donald Sutherland, and Michael J. Fox to come to Boston for an evening called Sketches of War, which raised money to convert the VA clinic where I met my patients into a shelter for homeless veterans. Standing on a stage with professional actors speaking about their memories of the war and reading their poetry was clearly a more transformative experience than any therapy could have offered them. Since time immemorial, human beings have used communal rituals to cope with their most powerful and terrifying feelings. Ancient Greek theater, the oldest of which we have written records, seems to have grown out of religious rites that involve dancing, singing, and reenacting mythical stories. By the 5th century BCE, theater played a central role in civic life, with the audience seated in a horseshoe around the stage, which enabled them to see one another's emotions and reactions. Greek drama may have served as a ritual reintegration for combat veterans. At the time, Aeschylus, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, it's a Greek word. Aeschylus wrote the Oresteia trilogy. Athens was at war on 6 fronts. The cycle of tragedy is set in motion when the returning warrior king Agamemnon is murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, for having sacrificed their daughter before sailing to the Trojan War. Military service was required of every adult citizen of Athens, so audiences were undoubtedly composed of combat veterans and active duty soldiers on leave. The performers themselves must have been citizen soldiers. Sophocles was a general officer in Athens' wars against the Persians, and his play Ajax, which ends with the suicide of one of the Trojan War's greatest heroes, reads like a textbook description of traumatic stress. In 2008, writer and director Brian Diores arranged a reading of Ajax for 500 Marines in San Diego and was stunned by the reception it received. Like many of us who work with trauma, Diores' inspiration was personal. He had studied classics in college and turned to the Greek text for comfort when he lost a girlfriend to cystic fibrosis. His project, The Theater of War, evolved from that first event, and with funding from the U.S. Department of Defense, this 2,500-year-old play has since been performed more than 200 times here and abroad to give voice to the plight of combat veterans and foster dialogue and understanding in their families and friends. Theater of War performances are followed by a town hall style discussion. I attended a reading of Ajax in Cambridge, Massachusetts, shortly after the news media had publicized a 27% increase in suicides among combat veterans over the previous 3 years. Some 40 people, Vietnam veterans, military wives, recently discharged men and women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, lined up behind the microphone. Many of them quoted lines from the play as they spoke about their sleepless nights, drug addiction, and alienation from their families. The atmosphere was electric, and afterward, the audience huddled in the foyer, some holding each other and crying, others in deep conversation. As Diores later said, anyone who has come into contact with extreme pain, suffering, or death has no trouble understanding Greek drama. It's all about bearing witness to the stories of veterans. New section on page 333, love that number, angel number. It's called Keeping Together in Time. Collective movement and music create a larger context for our lives, a meaning beyond our individual fate. Religious rituals universally involve rhythmic movements, from davening at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem to the sung liturgy and gestures of the Catholic Mass, to moving meditation and Buddhist ceremonies, and the rhythmic prayer rituals performed 5 times a day by devout Muslims. Music was a backbone of the civil rights movement in the United States. Anyone alive at that time will not forget the lines of marchers, arms length, singing "We Shall Overcome" as they walked steadily toward the police who were massed to stop them. Music binds together people who might individually be terrified, but who collectively become powerful advocates for themselves and others. That gave me goosebumps. Along with language, dancing, marching, and singing are uniquely human ways to install a sense of hope and courage. I observed the force of communal rhythms in action when I watched Archbishop Desmond Tutu conduct public hearings for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in 1996. These events were framed by collective singing and dancing. Witnesses recounted the unspeakable atrocities that had been inflicted on them and their families. When they became overwhelmed, Tutu would interrupt their testimony and lead the entire audience in prayer, song, and dance until the witnesses could contain their sobbing and halt their physical collapse. This enabled participants to pendulate in and out of reliving their horror and eventually to find words to describe what had happened to them. I fully credit Tutu and the other members of the commission with averting what might have been an orgy of revenge, as is so common when victims are finally set free. A few years ago, I discovered Keeping Together in Time, written by the great historian William H. McNeill near the end of his career. This short book examines the historical role of dance and military drill in creating what McNeill calls muscular bonding, and sheds a new light on the importance of theater, communal dance, and movement. It also solved a longstanding puzzle in my mind. Having been raised in the Netherlands, I had always wondered how a group of simple Dutch peasants and fishermen had won their liberation from this mighty Spanish Empire. The 80 Years' War, which lasted from the late 16th to the mid-17th century, began as a series of guerrilla actions, and it seemed destined to remain that way since the ill-disciplined, ill-paid soldiers regularly fled under volleys of musket fire. This changed when Prince Maurice of Orange became the leader of the Dutch rebels. Still in his early 20s, he had recently completed his schooling in Latin, which enabled him to read 1500-year-old Roman manuals on military tactics. He learned that the Roman general Lycurgus had introduced marching in step to the Roman legions, and that the historian Plutarch had attributed their invincibility to this practice. It was at once a magnificent and terrible sight to see them march on to the tune of their flutes without any disorder in their ranks, any discomposure in their minds, or change in their countenances, calmly and cheerfully moving with music at the deadly fight, or to the deadly fight. Prince Maurice instituted close order drill, accompanied by drums, flutes, and trumpets in his ragtag army. This collective ritual not only provided his men with a sense of purpose and solidarity, but also made it possible for them to execute complicated maneuvers. Close order drills subsequently spread across Europe, and to this day, the major services of the US military spend liberally on their marching bands, even though fifes and drums no longer accompany troops into battle. Neuroscientist Jacques Panksepp, who was born in the tiny Baltic country of Estonia, told me the remarkable story of Estonia's singing revolution. In June 1987, on one of those endless subarctic summer evenings, more than 10,000 concert goers at the Tallinn Song Festival grounds linked hands and began to sing patriotic songs that had been forbidden during half a century of Soviet occupation. These song fests and protests continued, and on September 11th, 1988, 300,000 people, about a quarter of the population of Estonia, gathered to sing and make a public demand for independence. By August 1991, the Congress of Estonia had proclaimed the restoration of the Estonian state. And when Soviet tanks attempted to intervene, people acted as human shields to protect Tallinn's radio and TV stations. As a columnist noted in the New York Times, imagine the scene in Casablanca in which the French patrons sing La Marseillaise in defiance of the Germans, then multiply its power by a factor of thousands, and you've only begun to imagine the force of the singing revolution. It's so cool. All right, new section on page 334 called Treating Trauma Through Theater. It is surprising how little research, It is surprising how little research exists on how collective ceremonies affect the mind and brain and how they might prevent or alleviate trauma. Over the past decade, I have had a chance to observe and study 3 different programs for treating trauma through theater. Urban Improv in Boston and the drama program it inspired in the Boston Public Schools and in our residential centers. The Possibility Project, directed by Paul Griffin in New York City, and Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Massachusetts, which runs a program for juvenile offenders called Shakespeare in the Courts. In this chapter, I'll focus on these 3 groups, but there are many excellent therapeutic drama programs in the United States and abroad, making theater a widely available resource for recovery. Despite their differences, all of these programs share a common foundation: confrontation of the painful realities of life and symbolic transformation through communal action. Love and hate, aggression and surrender, loyalty and betrayal are the stuff of theater and stuff of trauma. As a culture, we are trained to cut ourselves off from the truth of what we're feeling. In the words of Tina Packer, the charismatic founder of Shakespeare and Company, training actors involves training people to go against that tendency, not only to feel deeply, but to convey that feeling at every moment to the audience so the audience will get it and not close off against it. Traumatized people are terrified to feel deeply. They're afraid to experience their emotions because emotions lead to loss of control. In contrast, theater is about embodying emotions, giving voice to them, becoming rhythmically engaged, taking on and embodying different roles. As we've seen, the essence of trauma is feeling God-forsaken, cut off from the human race. Theater involves a collective confrontation with the realities of the human condition. As Paul Griffin, discussing his theater program for foster care children, told me, the stuff of tragedy in theater revolves around coping with betrayal, assault, and destruction. These kids have no trouble understanding what Lear, Othello, Macbeth, or Hamlet are all about. In Tina Packer's words, everything is about using the whole body and having other bodies resonate with your feelings, emotions, and thoughts. Theater gives trauma survivors a chance to connect with one another by deeply experiencing their common humanity. Traumatized people are afraid of conflict. They fear losing control and ending up in the losing side once again. Conflict is central to theater. Inner conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, family conflicts, social conflicts, and their consequences. Trauma is about trying to forget, hiding how scared, enraged, or helpless you are. Theater is about finding ways of telling the truth and conveying deep truths to your audience. This requires pushing through blockages to discover your own truth, exploring and examining your own internal experience so that it can emerge in your voice and body on stage. New section, page 336, called Making It Safe to Engage. These theater programs are not for aspiring actors, but for angry, frightened, or obstreperous teenagers or withdrawn, alcoholic, burned out veterans. When they come to rehearsal, they slump into their chairs, fearful that others will immediately see what failures they are. Traumatized adolescents are jumbled, inhibited, out of tune, inarticulate, uncoordinated, and purposeless. They are too hyper-aroused to notice what is going on around them. They are easily triggered and rely on action rather than words to discharge their feelings. All the directors I've worked with agree that the secret is to go slow and engage them bit by bit. The initial challenge is simply to get participants to be more present in the room. Here's Kevin Coleman, director of Shakespeare in the Courts, describing his work with teens when I interviewed him. First, we get them up and walking around the room. Then we start to create a balance in the space so they're not walking aimlessly, but become aware of other people. Gradually, with little prompts, it becomes more complex. Just walk on your toes or on your heels or walk backwards. Then when you bump into someone, scream and fall down. After maybe 30 prompts, they're out there waving their arms in the air and we get to a full body warm up, but it's incremental. If you take too big a jump, you'll see them hit a wall. You have to make it safe for them to notice each other. Once their bodies are a little bit more free, I might use the prompt, don't make eye contact with anyone, just look at the floor. Most of them are thinking, great, I'm doing that already. But then I say, now begin to notice people as you go by, but don't let them see you looking. And next, just make eye contact for a second. Then, now no eye contact, now contact, now no contact. Now make eye contact and hold it too long. You'll know when it's too long because you'll either want to start dating that person or to have a fight with them. That's when it's too long. They don't make that kind of extended eye contact in their normal lives, not even with the person they're talking to. They don't know if that person is safe or not. So what you're doing is making it safe for them to not disappear when they make eye contact or when someone looks at them, bit by bit by bit. Traumatized adolescents are noticeably out of sync. In the Trauma Center's Trauma Drama program, we use mirroring exercises to help them get in tune with one another. They move their right arm up and their partner mirrors it. They twirl and their partner twirls in response. They begin to observe how body movements and facial expressions change, how their own natural movements differ from those of others, and how unaccustomed movements and expressions make them feel. Mirroring loosens their preoccupation with what other people think of them and helps them attune viscerally, not cognitively, to someone else's experiences. When mirroring ends in giggles, it's a sure indication that our participants feel safe. In order to become real partners, they also need to learn to trust one another. An exercise in which one person is blindfolded while his partner leads him by the hand is especially tough for our kids. It's often as terrifying for them to be the leader, to be trusted by someone vulnerable, as it is to be blindfolded and led. At first, they may last for only 10 or 20 seconds, but we gradually work them up to 5 minutes. Afterward, some of them have to go off by themselves for a while because it is so emotionally overwhelming to feel those connections. The traumatized kids and veterans we work with are embarrassed to be seen, afraid to be in touch with what they are feeling, and they keep one another at arm's length. The job of any director, like that of any therapist, is to slow things down so the actors can establish a relationship with themselves, with their bodies, with their bodies. Theater offers a unique way to access a full range of emotions and physical sensations that not only put them in touch with the habitual set of their bodies, but also let them explore alternative ways of engaging with life. New section, page 337, called Urban Improv. And I actually think, okay, this is our final section for today. If you have not liked the video, please like the video. If you want to share it, share from week 1, por favor. If you have not subscribed, I would love to invite you to subscribe to my channel, support it in that way. It is completely free to you, and it helps to get these messages out to more people. Thank you so much. Okay, starting Urban Improv. My son loved his theater group, which was run by Urban Improv UI, a long-standing Boston arts institution. He stayed with them through high school and then volunteered to work with them the summer after his freshman year in college. It was then that he learned that UI's violence prevention program, which has run hundreds of workshops in local schools since 1992, had received a research grant to assess its efficacy, and that they were looking for someone to head the study. Nick suggested to the directors Kippy Dewey and Sissa Campion that his dad would be the ideal person for the job. Luckily for me, they agreed. I began to visit schools with UI's multicultural ensemble, which included a director, 4 professional actor educators, and a musician. Urban Improv creates scripted skits depicting the kinds of problems that students face every day: exclusion from peer groups, jealousy, rivalry and anger, and family strife. Skits for older students also address issues like dating, STDs, homophobia, and peer violence. In a typical presentation, the professional actors might portray a group of kids excluding a newcomer from a lunch table in the cafeteria. As the scene approaches a choice point, for example, the new student responds to their put downs, the director freezes the action. A member of the class is then invited to replace one of the actors and show how he or she would feel and behave in this situation. These scenarios enable the students to observe day-to-day problems, which some emotional distance while experimenting with various solutions. Excuse me. Will they confront the tormentors, talk to a friend, call the homeroom teacher, tell their parents what happened? Another volunteer is then asked to try a different approach so that students can see how other choices might play out. Props and costumes help the participants take risk in new roles, as do the playful atmosphere and the support of the actors. In the discussion groups afterward, students respond to questions like, how is this scene similar or different from what happens in your school? How do you get the respect that you need? And how do you settle your differences? These discussions become lively exchanges as many students volunteer their thoughts and ideas. Our Trauma Center team evaluated this program at 2 grade levels in 17 participating schools. Classrooms that participated in the UI program were compared with similar non-participating classrooms. At the 4th grade level, we found a significant positive response. On standardized rating scales for aggression, cooperation, and self-control, students in the UI group showed substantially fewer fights and angry outbursts, more cooperation and self-assertion with peers, and more attentiveness and engagement in the classroom. Much to our surprise, these results were not matched by the 8th graders. What happened in the interim that affected their responses? At first, we had only our personal impressions to go on. When I'd visited the 4th grade classes, I'd been struck by their wide-eyed innocence and their eagerness to participate. The 8th graders, in contrast, were often sullen and defensive and as a group seemed to have lost their spontaneity and enthusiasm. Onset of puberty was one obvious factor for the change, but might there be others? When we delved further, we found that the older children had experienced more than twice as much trauma as the younger ones. Every single 8th grader in these typical American inner city schools had witnessed serious violence. 2/3 had observed 5 or more incidents, including stabbings, gunfights, killings, and domestic assaults. Our data showed that 8th graders with such high levels of exposure to violence were significantly more aggressive than students without these histories, and that the program made no significant difference in their behavior. The Trauma Center team decided to see if we could turn the situation around with a longer and more intensive program that focused on team building and emotion regulation exercises. Excuse me, using scripts that dealt directly with the kinds of violence these kids experienced. For several months, members of our staff, led by Joseph Spinazzola, met weekly with the UI actors to work on script development. The actors taught our psychologists improvisation, mirroring, and precise physical attunement so they could credibly portray melting down, confronting, cowering, and collapsing. We taught the actors about trauma triggers and how to recognize and deal with trauma reenactments. During the winter and spring of 2005, we tested the resulting program at a specialized day school run jointly by the Boston Public Schools and the Massachusetts Department of Correction. This was a chaotic environment in which students often shuttled back and forth between school and jail. All of them came from high crime neighborhoods and had been exposed to horrendous violence. I had never seen such an aggressive and sullen group of kids. We got a glimpse into the lives of the innumerable middle school and high school teachers who deal daily with students whose first response to new challenges is to lash out or go into defiant withdrawal. We were shocked to discover that in scenes where someone was in physical danger, the students always sided with the aggressors. Because they could not tolerate any sign of weakness in themselves, they could not accept it in others. They showed nothing but contempt for potential victims, yelling things like, "Kill the bitch, she deserves it." During a skit about dating violence, At first, some of the professional actors wanted to give up. It was simply too painful to see how mean these kids were, but they stuck it out. And I was amazed to see how they gradually got the students to experiment, however reluctantly, with new roles. Toward the end of the program, a few students were even volunteering for parts that involved showing vulnerability or fear. When they received their certificate of completion, several shyly gave the actors drawings to express their appreciation. I detected a few tears, possibly even in myself. Our attempt to make trauma drama a regular part of the 8th grade curriculum in the Boston Public Schools unfortunately ran into a wall of bureaucratic resistance. Nonetheless, it lives on as an integral part of the residential treatment programs at the Justice Resource Institute, while music, theater, art, and sports, timeless ways of fostering competence and collective bonding, continue to disappear from our schools. That is really awesome and kind of not surprising that they were not able to implement that urban improv in program into the Boston schools, because apparently teaching people how to heal on a natural level, organic level, is not allowed because it doesn't make big pharma money. Anyway, little soapbox comment there. But you all, that is the end for today. We have one more week after this week. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sticking with me. This has been several months, as I think I took about a month break from reading. So thank you all so much for being here, sticking in it, gathering this information and I guess digesting it however it works for or with you. Some of the stuff is very tough to hear. So I guess just make sure that you're protecting your energy and letting go of the things that don't serve you or don't resonate. And I just really hope this is helping you all to understand some of the cycles that you might experience or come to terms with some of the things that you may have experienced in your life or early childhood. Again, all of my information is in the description box below. Follow my link tree that's going to have all my information in there. And it's like the central hub for everything that you'll need. It's at my email. I think my email is just in the description box. I still haven't figured out how to link that into Linktree. But I love you all so much. Thank you so much for being here. Remember, you are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. And I will see you on the next video. I love you. Bye.